Good morning and welcome to our monthly corner of Wareg, the Association of the European Water Regulators. I'm Cristian Minelli, General Coordinator of Wareg Secretariat, and today we are honored to have Szilvia Szalòki with us. Szilvia is the Vice President of the Hungarian Energy and Public Utility Regulatory Authorities. She is one of the founding members of Wareg, and she was recently re-elected in the Wareg board for a second mandate as Wareg Vice President. Szilvia, many thanks for being for your time and for being with us.
Thank you.
My first question for you, Szilvia, would be, was it a real surprise or did you somehow expect to be re-elected as Wareg Vice President a second time?
I would say I hope that my previous work added value to the board and the organization. Honestly, it is always a great pleasure to be re-elected, especially if you feel there are still challenges you are motivated about.
Could you tell us something about your expectations that encouraged you to be a member of Wareg board?
Water regulation covers a number of institutional frameworks and markets across Europe, but varies from country to country. Significant progress has been made in recent years in the European Union to rationalize the sector and harmonize practices and principles. Nevertheless, national water regulators have recognized the need for joint action and effort to address the challenges of water services which affect us all. The establishment of Wareg serves precisely this purpose, provides a framework and professional support.
I wonder if these expectations have changed over the last years.
Nowadays, we have to rethink the value of the water and our opportunities. The ambitious approaches cannot be focused locally, but rather globally. And there is a need for global communication and cooperation. We have a continuous dialogue, also in Wareg, and our efficiency lies in the fact that we can react very quickly to certain issues affecting the water utility sector, so that we have discussed the possible answers and solutions by comparing the different practices of several countries.
Can you please give us some background about your national...
Sorry, I could not hear the question.
Can you please give us some background about your national regulatory authority?
Yes, the Hungarian Energy and Public Utility Regulatory Authority, with this long name, was founded by a new act in 2013, and it's an independent regulatory body. Previously, it was the Hungarian Energy Office, which was established in 1994 as one of the first energy regulatory bodies in Europe. And the role of the authority has been continuously changing along with the development of the market structures and the operating models, as well as with the European legislation. Its main responsibilities are customer protection, providing regulated access to networks and systems, carrying out regulatory competencies in order to maintain security of supply and fostering competition. Within the complex field of customer protection, its key task is to keep end user prices on an affordable level, especially under the circumstances of economic and financial crisis. The scope of the infrastructures which have been overseen by the authority has been extended in 2011 with the complete regulation of district heating, and in 2012 with the water utilities and price regulation of wastewater services, and also solid waste. The authority is a central budgetary agency. As it was mentioned before, the authority is responsible for licensing, supervisory, price regulation and price and fee preparatory task, related to our fields: electricity, natural gas, district heating, and the water utility supply, and the preparation of the fee of the waste management public service. It performs tasks related to integrated national energy statistics and discharges obligations of supplying data to national, international, and other organizations as an official statistical agency. Since its establishment of the Hungarian regulatory body has become a regulator widely recognized through Europe and beyond its borders.
Very interesting, thank you. And what certifies the full independence of your organization?
First of all, and the most important, is that the authority is only subject to the law. The sole obligatory task is to report to the National Assembly annually, so every year we report to the National Assembly. The authority has a separate and independent budget from the national budget. Therefore, the authority covers its expenses related to its operation to the account of its own revenues. The authority's revenues are the following: supervision fee, regulatory and administrative fines, and administrative service fees, and some other income.
What do you think was one of the most challenging tasks faced by the Hungarian regulator in the past years?
I think the integration or the aggregation process, I'm definitely proud of that, which aggregation process has taken place in the water utility sector. It is important to emphasize that there has never been a comprehensive law for water services in Hungary until 2011. Before 1989, in the communist era, the main issues of water management were stipulated by legal acts, but the rules of service management, contracting, and the operation of water utilities had only a few regulations in the forms of secondary legislation. From the 1960s, the service providers were in public ownership, and the infrastructure as well. The scale of economics had been adequate since these companies operated on county level, providing services on a larger territory and to a larger community. The number of service providers varied between 33 and 38 at that time. After the change of the communist regime, a high level of privatization began in the water sector. And after the communist period, it was important to increase the level of private ownership in every part of life and reduce the level of public, especially state ownership. And in the 1990s, the state and the county-owned assets and companies were transferred into the ownership of local governments and privately owned companies. As the result of the high level of privatization, the formerly large service providers were split into hundreds of small companies operating on a small service area. So in 1995, a new act on water management was adopted, but the detailed rules of the operation of utilities and water services were still regulated on a lower level of legislation. The water prices were set by local governments and by the state, and the supervision of prices and the sector was not ensured. There was no responsible agency overseeing the market at that time. So as a result of this, by 2010, there were more than 400 service providers in our country operating with lack of economies of scale. So there have been more than 10,000 type or 10,000 different prices by this time in the country for different types of users. And after all, recognizing this negative trend, the Hungarian National Assembly adopted the Comprehensive Act for Water Services, as I mentioned, in 2011, to regulate the market and set up the Hungarian water regulator. And aggregation was a key objective, and the act made it possible in a gradual way. It created the instrument of operational license, which was necessary for a company to provide water services. To obtain a license, the company needed to show that they are able to provide services efficiently for a larger community. So it's a long story. It's not easy to understand, but I think it's very unique and very special, and it was a really quick and really big achievement for Hungary to do this aggregation in such a short time.
Really, it looks really like a long, complex aggregation process. And so who do you think are the key players of this process beyond the Hungarian regulatory authority?
The key players of the aggregation, of course, the service providers and the local government. The service providers or the service provider companies had to submit a request for an operational license by the new act, and they had to prove that they meet the basic and special conditions set by the law. When the regulator got the first requests, the number of service providers had already been reduced on the market. So, as I mentioned, more than 400 companies was providing services that time, but we got only 83 requests from the companies. Besides regular mergers, another solution was for local governments to sign an operational contract with a larger service provider. The local governments have the legal obligation to ensure the water service on their administrational area, and they can only perform this task if they have a signed contract with a chosen service provider. Since they are usually the owner of the infrastructure, they sign a leasing, asset management, or concession agreement with the service providers. In most of the cases, they sign a leasing agreement.
Okay, and which do you think were the main benefits perceived by the Hungarian water sector after the aggregation process?
Due to the aggregation process, the total number of service provider companies in the country reduced, and today we have only 40 companies having a license from the regulatory body. And as the result of aggregation, the number of service providers has been decreased, as I mentioned, which generates a change of quality of supply, because the remaining service providers are going to operate along more transparent conditions. A clear benefit is that the contractual relations are well regulated and transparent. The staff is more experienced, and the professional background of the service providers are better than it was before the reform. It is also a benefit that the central regulatory agency monitors the market, and the professional control is ensured by our authority.
And on the consumer side, what do you think they experienced from this aggregation process?
No doubt that the greatest beneficiaries were or are the customers, since the new system allowed the market to operate in transparency, while the quality of water service was improved all over the country. I would like to highlight that the operational licensing process lasted only 9 months. It was a real success. As I mentioned before, it was really unique, and the aggregation process was really quick. So I think I think the quickest aggregation in the world in the last decades. I'm sure about it.
Thank you. And which do you think were then the key incentives and instruments used for this aggregation process in the Hungarian water sector?
According to my experience, based on the Hungarian and other Wareg or European practices, I would say the following requirements for an aggregation process is really a need. The first and the most important, the political will. We were very lucky in Hungary, since the political will from 2010 was given to reform the water sector, and the solutions were already on the table from the past. And I think political will is the most important factor to implement an aggregation process, but is also the factor which is the hardest to achieve in any country. The second one, strong institutions and clear rules. It's another very important requirement is to find a player that is able to monitor the implementation, and when there are setbacks, it is able to intervene. In the Hungarian case, it was the independent water regulator, and I think it's a good solution in many cases. I mean, to have a regulator to implement and intervene if it's necessary. It is also necessary to vest the agency with every competency that is needed to implement the aggregation process. I have seen examples where aggregation has failed because the clarity of competencies of separate institutions were lacking. So it is important to set clear rules and obligations for every player. The third one, I would say transparency and communication, which is obvious that the public and the owners of infrastructure has to understand the necessity of a new system. Therefore, clear communication is a key factor. And then creating efficient operations and the scale of economics, it's also very important. These two are always in connection with each other and always the main incentives of aggregation. And last but not least, data collection, because information asymmetry can only be reduced if a nominated agency has the competency to collect, monitor, and analyze the data of the whole sector. In my opinion, these powers have to be vested with one single organization with the responsibility to publish this data and information to the public and other stakeholders in the sector.
Thank you. And there may have been many barriers, I believe, during this aggregation process. Which ones do you think were the hardest ones you had to overcome?
At the beginning of the reform, the first very important task was to hire professional staff, I mean at the regulatory body. And the majority of the crew are still employed within the organization. So now we are in a good situation because we have really professional staff. But at the beginning, it was really big. It was a challenging situation to have the right staff. When we started the licensing process, we found some local governments and service providers unwilling to follow the rules of the new regulation, as always, and we had to intervene very quickly. And as I mentioned before, settling the ownership of water-related infrastructure was also an objective of the law. And we had several cases where it was difficult to transfer private assets into the ownership of the local government by the deadlines set out by the law. So these were the biggest barriers, I think.
And for the future, what are the biggest challenges in water utility regulation in Hungary?
The water sector nowadays is in a state of an unfinished reform. Every step of the reform, especially the aggregation process, went down quite early and quickly, but the only missing component, the new tariff system, has never been introduced. The service providers have to deal with the aging of the infrastructure and the fluctuation of their professional staff. So the challenge is to operate and maintain our networks, and there is a need for a review of water pricing to include investment and maintenance needs. In the future, it will be necessary to finish the reform process and adopt the new water tariffs, which are in line with the principle of cost recovery. I think that's the near future. I hope so.
Okay, this expectation seems completely clear from all the stakeholders of the in Hungary. How can you manage this situation?
We constantly predict the potential risks and consequences by the competent stakeholders if there would be it would not be any changes. This process is supported by the data management. As I mentioned above, the authority, our authority is responsible for data gathering as well. In 2020, our authority carried out the review of data collection system. And the aim of the supervision to simplify the reporting process and to redesign the local structure of the forms. It can be confirmed that the quality of data service is on higher standard by now. The future aim is to finish the establishment of the data management platform, which is called Integrated Water Utility Database in Hungary.
Thank you, Szilvia. And now I have one very last question for you. Were the service providers involved in this process? And if yes, how?
Of course, they were. This reform emphasizes the importance of having open and direct communication with the service providers. We provided opportunity to comment the structure of data sheets and the content also. And we published guidelines and organized workshops to facilitate the changeover.
Many thanks again to Szilvia Szalòki, Vice President of the Hungarian Energy and Public Utility Regulatory Authority and Vice President of Wareg, the Association of European Water Regulators. Stay tuned with Wareg LinkedIn and subscribe to Wareg newsletter at the link below, and see you next month. Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.